Part 2, Burning Man, New York, New York to Seattle, Washington. Chapter 9, I can't remember to forget you. New York, New York to Kennebunkport, Maine. On August 5th, the short bus rolled out of New York City with a new passenger, my sister Kelly. She quickly settled into the co-pilot seat and bravely tackled the first and most important responsibility of any co-pilot, reading the map. With confidence, she shouted out directions to help me find I-95 North and promptly got us lost. It turned out that Kelly had a significant map-reading disability, a perfect co-pilot for the short bus. When we finally found the highway, the traffic on I-95 was horrible, as it always is. Large trucks were speeding to and from New England. There were potholes and narrow lanes. This was a road I knew well from my many travels to and from Brown. Our plan was to spend the night in Providence with a friend of mine from college, and then head up to Maine the next day. The stop in Providence wasn't a necessity. We very easily could have kept driving all the way to Maine, but I hadn't really been back since I graduated, and it seemed fitting to stop. Brown was the place where I both metaphorically got off the short bus and paradoxically got back on. I went to Brown with no understanding of myself as a part of a community of outsiders. I went to Brown lost between the dumb kid who could only play soccer and a new identity, which I had to create from the space left over from the person I used to be. It was nice to be traveling with Kelly. Kelly was born in San Francisco and lived there until she was almost 12. I've come to have an ambiguous sense of Kelly's early life. It is not something that's been talked about directly, but it was a time of chaos. This has been filtered through many years of family amnesia, lies, and denials. I was never told directly about what happened by Kelly or anyone else. I guess, like most of my family history, I came to know this fact through years of osmosis, of body language, of someone yelling at someone else over Christmas dinner. But even in the middle of this chaos, Kelly always came through as a strong individual, even from an early age. She never really babbled as a kid, just went right to talking. When Kelly was 2 years old, she often refused to walk even though she physically could. She was famous for her sit-down strikes. Whenever she felt like it, Kelly would sit down wherever she was and refuse to move for however long she pleased. She always seemed to be around during important moments in my life. Kelly is 10 years older than I am, but she is closer to my age than my other two siblings. She is much like me when it comes to our school experiences. Long after she left for college, I found what I thought was, because of the handwriting, one of my notebooks buried in a box. I pulled it out and took it to school, and it turned out to be Kelly's from years before. The irony, though, is that Kelly was never labeled learning disabled, but gifted. It's common family knowledge that out of all of us, Kelly is the most intelligent. I'm asking all the time how I could ever have gotten into, let alone graduated from, an Ivy League college like Brown. I have all sorts of academic answers, but I couldn't have done it without Kelly. Her support and her presence in my life helped me survive my negative experiences in school. Kelly provided me with a place to go to make sense out of the pain of my life. I still remember the day I realized this. It was Christmas time. I was in 4th grade, sitting with Kelly in the living room in our house on Nelson Street. Kelly was in high school and was depressed. She ditched school most days and went to therapy and ate ice cream right out of the container. I know she felt like she had no place at school, no place at home. Kelly, along with my other two siblings, Billy and Michelle, were the only kids on assisted lunch in school, and they talked like kids who grew up in a housing project. Kelly was emerging into herself as an artist, a creative thinker who did not fit into upper middle class Manhattan Beach. Within this world, Kelly had created her own space. She lived in a wild, beautiful room. She decorated her space with a huge mural with pink pigs using a big stencil she bought at the fabric store. She had 5 stuffed pigs as well, and each had its own name. There was Mbaba, Ababa, Arribari-bidi-bidi-bum-baba, Louie, Louie, and my favorite, Stan, the man. Kelly slept through most of Christmas break. She had the house to ourselves. We had the house to ourselves, and we sat in the living room talking. I had no words for what was going on in school. I just felt numb. We sat on our plaid sofa, passing a container of ice cream back and forth. "I'm depressed," she said to me. I had no idea what that word meant, but I knew what she was talking about. "I am too," I said, handing the carton back over to her. We sat like that for an hour eating ice cream, talking about music and how school hurt us, though neither of us actually went to school much that year. When the ice cream carton was empty, she said to me, "Good can come from bad. I just haven't found the good yet." That idea made a huge difference in my life. Kelly would repeat almost the exact same thing to me years later, on the night I was arrested for a DUI. This breakdown had been a long time coming. Winter break, my freshman year at Loyola Marymount, I slept on Kelly's floor and felt like I couldn't move. I didn't eat ice cream, but I read a lot of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and slept until 3 in the afternoon. It had been a pretty terrible year. Soccer was fucked. I had injured my ankle the first day of training camp and recovered about 4 games into the season, only to play with tendinitis in my knee for the rest of the year. I was getting my ass kicked in school. It felt like the fabric of myself was ripped, and I didn't know how to stitch it back together. It would take a year for things to change. The next semester I got chickenpox and was in bed for a month and stopped playing soccer. I began taking classes in literature and poetry. The next year, in the 4th soccer game of the season, I broke my leg and tore ligaments in my ankle in the final seconds. I lay on the field in tears, filled with grief. The day of my DUI, I had gone to San Pedro with my roommate, Ive, to celebrate a birthday with his family. They were first-generation Croatian Americans, and that day we ate Croatian food and talked Baltic politics. After the party, Ive and I drove back to LA, and it started to rain. It poured like the sky had broken. The car felt like it was floating, and the Talking Heads song Once in a Lifetime came on the radio. That night was the end of the year's soccer banquet. Because of my injury, I felt like a fraud even attending. By dinner, I was drunk. The rest of the night, pretty much unconscious, I drove a group of friends from party to party with a car full of people. I ran a red light, and there was a cop car behind me. I was arrested. Kelly was the first and only person I called. I slept that night on her floor and begged her to run me over with a car. That night she told me, "Good can come from bad. You just haven't found the good yet." It would take a long time for the good to come from my experiences. Shortly after the DUI, I got it in my head that I would transfer from LMU. Transferring was an idea that Kelly gave me. She had transferred from the University of California at San Diego to UCLA. I have to admit, the first time she mentioned it to me, I laughed out loud. Without playing soccer, I thought schools would take one look at my high school transcripts, light my application on fire, piss on it, and send the whole package back to me with a nice pink bow. Kelly knew better. She told me that often for transfers, high school grades are devalued, as are SAT scores. I made a list of schools myself and booked a ticket to the East Coast for my winter break. Some schools agreed to interview me, some didn't. At those schools that opted not to interview me, I sat outside the admissions office until someone would meet with me. I guessed from the experiences that I had been through something, a determination, a resilience had come from, not in spite of the bad. Kelly was right again. It took us 4 hours to get to Providence. As we rounded the curve of the interstate into downtown, it felt like I was going back in time. It was a landscape that I knew well. Driving into Providence felt like coming home. This was a strange feeling, because if there was any place where I felt like an utter outsider, it was at Brown, a world of kids who could name all the Ivy League schools by the time they were 10. I had no idea what an Ivy League school was until I was 19, but Providence felt like the place where I became the person I am today. Transferring to Brown was the most important decision that I had made, and Kelly was a part of that. I looked at Kelly in the rearview mirror. Her belief that we can transform the pain of our experiences was passed on to me and remains essential to my life. Before we found a parking place, I turned around and said, "Dude, I know we have never talked about this, but would you do away with the struggles you had as a kid?" She did not hesitate in answering, "No way. Sometimes these painful things make you who you are." We spent the day in Providence before heading to Maine. The next morning I got up early before the students. I took a cup of coffee in the Maine Green and sat where I had sat years before, almost to the day, for transfer orientation, and I thought about the first trip to Brown. In early August 1997, my mom and I drove up together from New York City. We were quiet most of the ride. My life was packed into the trunk of my brother's Honda Accord, and I wore soccer shoes, old Sambas with white stripes. I wore these shoes every day at Brown until the soles fell off during my senior year. Things were changing between my mom and me. Soccer had something to do with it, I'm sure. The entire summer before I transferred, I told myself and my mom that I would play soccer at Brown. All my good feelings about myself came from that game. Without it, I was the stupid kid. But I was sick of playing, literally. I woke up before games and felt like I had the flu. Ironically, it was actually my mom, of all people, who gave me the courage not to play soccer at Brown. I had ditched a lot of school when I was younger with my mom's blessing. We usually went to the zoo. Mental health days, my mom called them. But we ditched the first day of school only once. We didn't go to the zoo that day. We rented shitty bikes somewhere in Marina del Rey and rode them all the way to Santa Monica. The chain on my bike kept falling off, but I didn't care. I wanted to get stranded at sea and never come back. When we got to Santa Monica, we walked to the edge of the pier and I played skeet ball and watched the men from South LA fish. I looked down inside each of their baskets to see what they had caught. I ate a few fries and we walked to the edge of the water and my mom held my hand. We walked to the swing set and I got on one of the big swings. My mom told me the same story she always told about the day she fell off a slide and broke her arm. She lifted that arm and ran her hand down the length of the scar that formed from the break. I launched myself forward in the sky. When I was done swinging, I said to my mom, "I don't want to go." And she said, "You don't have to." What a gift from my mom. You don't have to do what they tell you to do. Make your own life. The question for me was, while my mom could tell me that about school, could she say the same thing about soccer? Soccer was always the place where I was better than the rich kids in Manhattan Beach, and that was really important to her. I was terrified to tell my mom that I had decided not to play at Brown, but when I finally did, as we drove to Brown to see the school, she looked at me and said clearly and strongly, You don't have to do anything if you don't want to." I was greeted at the Brown transfer registration by a bald man wearing horn-rimmed glasses who spoke in a dialect of artist intellectual that was unfamiliar to me. He was a nice man, though. "I'm Steve," he said. Then after 5 minutes of registration formalities, he said to me, "I need a wacky fact, man." "What?" I asked. "It is just a stupid icebreaker for later," he said. "You know, something wacky about yourself. You speak German or spent a year traveling the world, something like that." German was out. I looked down at my old sambas. Then I looked at Steve and pulled from deep inside myself something I had never said to anyone. I don't know where it came from. From Kelly, from the outings at the zoo with my mom, maybe. From the space between the past and the present. "Well," I said to Steve, "my wacky fact is that I did not learn to read until I was 12, and I'm dyslexic." That night at orientation, all the transfer students sat around in a circle. "Okay," the transfer counselor said, "let's each introduce ourselves. Tell us where you have transferred from and maybe what you did this summer." So it began. "I transferred from Yale, and I worked for the NIH this summer. I transferred from Princeton and worked on a cure for cancer. I transferred from Harvard, and I'm on the short list for the Nobel Prize." What was I doing here? Who was I to think that I had a place here? Then someone stood up. A guy with purple hair, bicycle chains around his wrists, paint-smeared jeans, and said, "My name is Dave. I transferred from a 2-year college for kids with learning disabilities and attention. Let's say attention issues, a TARD school, and I worked in construction last summer." I thought to myself, that's my boy. I went right up to Dave. "What's your fact, man?" he asked me. I told him, "Dyslexic?" He said to me, I nodded my head because I couldn't get the words out. Dave nodded back like we spoke the same dialect of Tardese. "My fact," he said, unprompted, "is that I learned to weld when I was 11 years old." He paused and raised his eyebrows and then laughed. "So it seemed that I learned to weld before you learned to read." I thought I could feel the world shifting. I looked at him like I might cry for joy. "That," I said, "is fucking hysterical." We stood in the hollowed-out old school building for an hour and talked about hiding in the bathroom and feeling defective. In less than 2 months, we started writing a book together that would later be published. In that space, my relationship to disability and to normalcy changed. I was still a little ashamed of being dyslexic. Still striving for normalcy. But right then, we were 2 brown students standing in the yellow light of old school building. 2 outsiders, not knowing what was in front of them, but knowing at least we were not alone. That day, Kelly and I left Providence. I had lunch with a friend of mine named Matt. He was 17 years old and had been diagnosed ADHD and bipolar. A few years earlier, he had attended one of my talks. After it ended, he emailed me and told me a little bit about his life. At one point, when Matt should have been attending high school, he didn't leave his room for most of the year. In that room, he thought about killing himself. Not in some dramatic or violent way, but in a clinical way. I wondered, as I drove to meet him, did Matt come out of that room more or less himself? Was Kelly right? Does good come from bad? Can we create anything from these experiences? At the very least, Matt had a great sense of humor. He ended the first email to me by telling me that I had left 20 cents on the stage after my talk. If I was ever in Providence again, I could collect my 20 cents, plus any interest owed. Matt and I had lunch together on the east side of Providence. When I picked him up at his home, he had come down the stairs wearing baggy jeans and no shirt. His hair was shorter than the last time I saw him. And he looked different, older and bigger in some way, but he also seemed withdrawn. His personality sucked inside of himself like a kid sucking in his cheeks. But between Matt's quiet moments were bursts of his self that wove everything together or forced everything apart. At lunch, we talked about school and his plans for the future. He seemed scared that the deep depression, which had almost cost him his life, might come back. But at least now he knew what had brought it on. Bipolar disorder. You know, man, that really fucking helped me. For Matt's whole life, his mood swings were written off as him being a pain in the ass. Now he had a name for them. Sometimes this makes all the difference. Matt also had a plan. Fuck school, he said. I'm going to city year. After lunch, he went back to his house to say goodbye. Matt lived with his folks in an old and worn-out, beautiful place that felt as comfortable as broken-in jeans. The home had no air conditioners, so all the windows were open and the breeze fluttered into the rooms. Before I left, I asked Matt if he wanted to write something on the bus. The entire wall of Matt's bedroom was filled with quotes from books in a black Sharpie pen. He told me that he writes on his wall like we write to each other. Sure, he said as he grabbed his Sharpie. It took a while for Matt to figure out what he wanted to make permanent. After a few minutes, he wrote, "Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play." "That's it?" I said. "No," he said as he started to pace. I watched him and thought about my old self who used to live in this city. I thought I could feel him shedding his skin again, turning inside out, trying to remember who he once was, so he could know who he could be. I watched Matt trying to create that self that fits him best. Finally, Matt stretched out his arm, and in black on white, turning gray, he wrote a line from the movie Memento. "I can't remember to forget you." Back at the hotel, I found Kelly dancing to a Madonna song emanating from her newly acquired iPod via a small white beatbox. She looked at me very seriously. "Tunes!" she shouted. Kelly has a passion for music. Some of my first memories of her were driving in one of her messy cars filled with cigarette smoke and blaring music. "Now we can go to Maine," she said, pointing to the white beatbox. It was in her cars, in her messy apartments, always filled with music, where I learned that my past did not determine my future, that I could change. I laughed at her and said, "You know, you give me courage." She did. Her presence convinced me that somehow something worth knowing would come from this journey. She walked over and gave me a hug and then said, "Dude, I have to say, if a woman with no job, no money, 2 cats, who lives with her parents gives you courage, you have some serious fucking problems." Kelly spent most of the drive rocking out in the back, and I watched her dance like a little kid at a wedding. I always loved music as a child, but I was ashamed of this passion. My mom, a radical Philistine, denounced any music or art that wasn't for the revolution. But even this was a pose. Mom was passionate about Bob Dylan, U2, Bruce Springsteen, of course any band that sang about the working man or politics. But she also fell in love with Paul Simon's Rhythm of the Saints. I caught her one day playing this album. She was standing near the sink, her sleeves rolling up from washing dishes, the scarf on her arm white on her skin, staring at the window, watching the snow fall. She moved her lips without making a sound. When she saw me, she turned the music off and looked to the floor as if I'd seen her naked. Music can do that. Take us out of our skin and help us become someone new. Billy Joel's Greatest Hits was the first album that truly changed me. Of course, I had a few things I loved before that. I was obsessed with turning Japanese and used to stand on our kitchen table and, quite offensively, modify the shape of my eyes while singing that fine ode to the fear of foreigners. Then, of course, there was Whip It. The less said about that, the better. But Billy's Greatest Hits was the only tape my dad had in his car. He never played it when I was in the car, so I waited for the times after school or soccer practice when he left me alone to run an errand. When he was out of sight, I climbed into the front seat and opened the cassette case. I was only 8 or 9, but when the album came on, I was no longer in the world of malls and cold hallways. When I saw my dad coming, I ejected the tape and stared out of the window like nothing had happened. Something as good as Billy had to be hidden. After Billy, nothing could touch Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. Kelly, as it happened, had this music on her iPod, and I asked her to play it as we drove out of Providence toward Maine. Kind of Blue was the soundtrack to my first semester at Brown. I had never heard anything like Miles' horn, the controlled and beautiful chaos of the structured improvisation. I listened to that album every day of that semester. It was fall on the East Coast with its diminishing light and humid cold air sticking to my skin like cellophane. Miles was the sound of me not playing soccer, the sound of old buildings and prep school cadences, the sound of not knowing who I was or what I was doing. It was the sound of change. Kelly and I spent the night in Bedford, New Hampshire, at a Holiday Inn, and I had a dinner with an acquaintance of mine named John and his parents. John had had a traumatic brain injury from an illness when he was a kid. He was 19 or so, and we had met briefly after a conference. He introduced himself by saying to me that his face was swollen because he ate too much. He rambled for a long time, moving between coherency and its opposite until I excused myself. When I told John that I might stop to see him on my travels, he started leaving me messages on my cell phone such as, "Dude, 12:45, and take a right, left, right." Things along those lines. Over dinner, John's parents told me the story of what had happened to their son. As they talked, John shut up for the first time all night and sat perfectly still and listened. John's sight had been blurry when he woke up one morning in elementary school. He thought he was tired, but got on the bus and rode to school as usual. It was after first period when the sides of his eyes started feeling funny and he felt hot, like he was under a heater. He didn't want to miss the project that his class was working on, but he wanted his mom. He walked up to the teacher and asked to go to the nurse. The long hallway to the nurse's office shook and his ears rang. His throat closed up. The sound of the other classes broke over him. He never made it to the nurse. A janitor found him and carried his hot body to the office, and someone called an ambulance. John was unconscious, and the EMT thought he would die before they reached the hospital. He was in a coma for the next week in a hermetically sealed room with researchers from the U.S. Centers of Disease Control and Prevention in spacesuits testing him. He had encephalitis. His brain had swelled and had pushed against his skull, causing massive bleeding and damage. He would never be the same. "I'm almost the same, John, again," he said after the story was over. It had been almost 10 years since the incident. His parents nodded their heads, and I knew it just wasn't so. For a long time, I wanted to hope that finally things were okay. We had recovered from our troubles. I wanted that for John, for me, for Kelly, for all of us carrying around painful things that had happened. I wanted to believe there is some essential self, that we're not just these sets of injuries and responses to injuries. I hope that something about ourselves is transcendent, that we're not just the brain matter and these electrons, not just a collection of dents and holes. But it seemed to me that John came out of that hospital room different, changed. He came out of the hospital room with a broken head and a different life and future. John's mom drove me back to the Holiday Inn that night after dinner. We didn't talk much, but as we got closer to the hotel, I asked her if what happened to John had changed her. I am a completely different person, she said. I was going to live one of those lives, fancy car, big house in the suburb. Those lives. John's injury changed all that, and I'm grateful for it. I have different values now. When something breaks, we can choose how we make sense of it, and John's mom chose to see change in a positive light. Maybe the human experience is like a split tree trunk, the tree incorporating a moment of violence and trauma and growing around itself. We all have damaged selves in some way. And the question is, do you put yourself back together holding on to that flickering image of the ideal self? Or do you let that go and you see yourself for what you are, damaged, with other parts of you stronger for it? I don't think we can ever be anything other than imperfect shadows of some impossible ideal. Standing in front of the Holiday Inn, I thought about this time with John and the rest of the journey. After Maine, Kelly and I would head back into the middle of the country, and I would start the long journey back home. But first, Kelly and I would ride together into the Nevada desert, into the Black Rock City and Burning Man, where the freaks of this country were gathering to create something new. Can, as Kelly said, good come from bad if we have the courage to find and create the good. In the stories to come, I hoped to find out. It took 3 hours traveling in suffocating summer traffic to get to Kennebunkport. Kelly and I didn't really talk. We were still settling into the trip. Yet, we couldn't get too comfortable. More change was on the way. In 2 days, our friend Christopher, who had helped modify the bus, would join us to help make a documentary of our journey. But he would also become a little more than just a cameraman. Kelly, it seems, had already developed a huge crush on him. Once in Kennebunkport, we played for 3 nights with John and Miriam Whitehouse and their family. Miriam was one of those moms I had met while doing a presentation. Her family was made up of working-class Mainers trying to hold on to their community as it changed from a small town to a suburb of Portland, to a land of summer homes filled with Massachusetts license plates. I had traveled to Maine not to see the Whitehouses, but to spend time with a man named Cookie. Miriam had introduced me to Cookie when I was staying in their home for a week during a previous trip. One night we all got drunk, and over the howling wind of the March snowstorm, Miriam told me about a man who was considered the town eccentric. He lived in Cape Pourbois, the working-class fishing village that lies beneath Kennebunk and Kennebunkport, which are predominantly wealthy communities. Cookie was an old-school Mainer who had made a living working on the piers. Most people, and some who have known Cookie his entire life, considered him to have a developmental disability, though Cookie did not see himself as disabled in any way. I remember the way Miriam's voice changed as she supplied further details. Cookie, who is well over 6 feet tall, also walks around town in a dress, high heels, fake tits and a blonde wig, she told me. In addition, she said Cookie was a painter, mostly of primitive Maine landscapes. I remember asking Miriam how she and the rest of the town made sense of Cookie. Was he crazy? A transvestite? Mentally delayed? She looked at me like I was crazy. We just think of him as Cookie.